Adobe Acrobat Studio, so brand new. Show me all the things PDFs can do. Do your work with ease and speed. PDF Spaces is all you need. Do hours of research in an instant with key insights from an AI assistant. Pick a template with a click. Now your prezzo looks super slick. Close that deal? Yeah, you won. Do that, doing that, did that, done. Now you can do that with Acrobat. Now you can do that with the all-new Acrobat. It's time to do your best work with the all-new Adobe Acrobat Studio.
I'm Aislinn Green, and this is Unpacked, the podcast that unpacks one tricky topic in travel each week. And this week, we're kicking off our Off the Beaten Path series. In this series, a local who lives in a popular destination shares travel tips, etiquette, advice, and more to help us go beyond the tourist hotspots and really get to know the places we visit. And we're starting with one of the world's most iconic and most touristed cities, Paris. Our local guide is Lindsey Tramuta, an American culture and travel journalist who has lived in Paris for more than 20 years. She's also the author of the books The New Paris and The New Parisienne, and she's the host of a podcast titled The New Paris. Throughout her work, Lindsey has explored the people and ideas shaping Paris, and in today's episode, she shares how she's seen the city change over the decades. She also shares what it's been like since the Olympics and the Paralympics wrapped, insights into Parisian fashion, and the one thing you should always do when you're in Paris, and I promise it's much easier than you might think. Lindsey, welcome to Unpacked. It's so nice to actually see you in person after working with you for so many years.
Thanks. It's good to see you. I think maybe once we spoke on the phone, but this is a different experience.
It's a totally different experience. It's really fun. And we're talking to you today because you have this vast experience with France. You have lived there for how many years now?
Nearing 20, actually, which is insane.
How does that feel?
How does that feel? Well, it feels like I've lived like a couple of lives, and I don't really recall what it felt like to be the person before, but I know I obviously went through it and I lived it. But no, I mean, France really does feel like home to the extent that being in the US feels very foreign almost. And I think that happens to a lot of people who have spent sort of their formative years elsewhere. I mean, wherever that might be. And certainly, you know, this being a major capital in Europe means that a lot of my values and my expectations and my mannerisms have become, you know, more European. And so the abruptness and the speed of things on, well, at least the East Coast. I mean, I know you're coming at it from the slower side of America, but it feels very jarring. And I've changed a lot as a person, I think, in the time that I've lived here, which I guess is to be expected.
Of course. Yeah. And then you are immersed in this other culture. So of course if it's working, you're going to be part of that culture, right? I interviewed someone, a polyglot last week, and she was talking about how learning different languages has actually changed her. Like she becomes a different person as she becomes more fluent. Do you feel like that happened?
100%. It's such an interesting phenomenon because, you know, in some cases, it might be more or less confidence that you have in that other language. I think it varies on the context or the people I'm with. There are times I can feel so much more confident in French, and then others where I feel like I'm a version of myself I don't even recognize, and then vice versa. So I think it allows you to, you know, test certain personas, which is quite interesting, just going through life, and become, when you need to, someone who's a little bit more adaptable. I mean, that's the other great thing about language or living elsewhere, is that it forces you into a situation where at some point you've had to or you will have to adapt.
Yeah. I mean, we could all use more of that, right?
Yeah. Just because, you know, we're not really good at change, right, as humans. So if you're forced to, you know, get comfortable with wherever you're living or the people you're living with or engaging with, I think it allows you to be adaptable and apply that, maybe that agility to other parts of your life. So, you know, having another language has opened up so many things for me. And I think really fundamentally, the French don't think the way Americans do in a lot of ways. And so that also allows me to look back at my home country with a more critical lens. And, you know, so it's all these things that language and living elsewhere does to you, and that you get a little bit when you're traveling, but certainly not in the profound way that you can when you're on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've lived in Paris for most or much of that time?
Oh,
Is
the whole
that
time.
the
Yeah,
whole
the whole
time?
time.
Okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
wow. Wow.
That's partially why I wrote The New Paris, because it was like there was a period of such tremendous change, and a lot of that had to do with the financial downturn of 2008, 2009, and seeing that as being a really big shift in the way people did business and approached life here. It definitely marked a turning point, I think, in my appreciation for Parisian, well, their own adaptability, really, because it had been a long time since they had felt any kind of big disruption in the way that that economic crisis had really spurred something. And it was sort of, yeah, a cycle of change. But from that came, a lot of very inventive businesses, restaurants, concepts, urban projects. It was like a moment of real change.
That's amazing. And then have you also seen something similar come out of the pandemic?
It was huge. I mean, certainly there were a lot of negatives, but some of the policies and transformations the city had already started undergoing, long before COVID, initiated by Hidalgo, our mayor, and her administration, including all of the bike lanes and the miles and miles of bike lanes, and really trying to deprioritize car dependency and curb pollution. All of that really sort of shined even brighter during COVID. And certainly when we were locked down for a significant amount of time, everything glistened. And the ability to have roads to yourself, grand avenues to yourself, when we were able to actually go outdoors, of course, it felt almost like, sort of Sleeping Beauty waking up and having an entirely new home. The bike lanes have only continued to expand since then. So that was another thing I think is one of the lasting and most visible marks from COVID. Was there were all these lanes that were made temporary for COVID and then now have become permanent. So it just accelerated some things.
Yeah, I see that silver lining. Not that the pandemic was in any way a positive thing, but it is interesting to see the ways that cities have changed in its wake. And you've talked about that a little because you have your podcast, the New Paris podcast, which is in its 8th season.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
It's crazy. Congratulations.
It's a lot of time. Thanks.
Yeah, a lot of interviews you've done over these last 8 years. But in a recent episode, you talked about how Paris is this global leader in urban transformation, especially in comparison to what you saw on a recent trip back to the United States. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, what struck me about being in the US the last time was just the infrastructure that felt like it really needed an update. Whether it was like potholes left and right that hadn't been, filled or handled, or just a sense of being completely run down. And I think Paris has, areas that are that way or could use a little bit more, care and love. But for the most part, the pandemic specifically was like doubling down on, okay, we have this opportunity to try to make a lasting impact based on some of the, the improvements we're seeing, since people are not driving around, they're not using the space in the same way. And I think that care in trying to improve livability is something that makes Paris so interesting to follow, especially if you're interested in seeing how big cities adapt to, global issues, including climate issues. And so it's kind of had to do this because pollution has always been an issue here. But it just felt more jarring to see how a place like Paris has redone all these neighborhood squares, or big, sort of prominent squares in the heart of Paris, how they've planted trees and taken away parking spots in order to create these greener, like a barrier along a lot of roads, which also just creates a feeling of, well, it enhances the neighborhood feel. And it's also, one of several solutions to try to improve air quality and create, a cooler environment. But so, there's this real commitment to giving the city back to Parisians, and also trying to, even do the uncomfortable, which is, take car space away from people. And then you go to New York, and I went to the Philly area, and it just felt run down. And it could have been just the phase, maybe I
Sure.
came and saw it in a less than perfect light. Maybe it just had been a while. But generally speaking, and because you were talking about the episode I did with an urbanist who used to live in New York and so, sees the difference between the way Paris addresses certain issues, I think it's not all just my imagination.
Kind of going back to the beginning of your time there, I'm curious to know what drew you to Paris initially and what keeps you there now, 20 years later.
Well, I studied French literature and linguistics, and I was not really a Francophile like most of the people I know here who are foreign, and it's not 100% the case, but the majority of people are really choosing to live here because they have a profound fascination or appreciation for French culture. And I would say my love for it came via language first. And so I studied for a summer and then I came back for my final semester of my undergraduate studies. And so when I was able to stay beyond that, it was really because I was living out what I had always wanted, which was to live a life in French. So I'm here in the sort of the hub of where I could see how a life could develop where I'm able to sort of have one foot in sort of an international world, but also be entrenched in a French world. But after that, why do I stay? I mean, culture, gastronomy, life balance, and I've written about this a bit in the last couple of years, but the healthcare system is, I don't want to paint it as a panacea because it really is struggling more now financially. I mean, this system that is so generous costs the country a lot of money. But the fact that even if I had to pay out of pocket for something, we're not talking about the same sums as we're talking about in the US. And so it is almost inconceivable for me to imagine living in a place that doesn't have this as sort of a basic value. And it does create a shift in perception and your long-term values as well. So if I stay today, it's sort of for all of those things, and that I still want to be able to live this life in two languages, really.
Kaylee Cuoco and Sam Claflin star in the MGM Plus original series, Vanished. When the man Alice loves disappears on a train to the south of France, every romantic memory becomes evidence. Every intimate detail, a potential threat. She thought she knew everything about him, but she may not even know his real name. 4-part thriller Vanished premieres February 1st on MGM Plus. Finding the truth is a dangerous affair.
Well, we are recording this in September, and it's been a bit since the Olympics. So I'm curious to know what you've seen in this post-Olympic Paris and what you imagine the long-term benefits or effects of the Olympics will be on the city. And, also looking at it from a visitor lens.
So interesting because we were so negative and so cynical right up to the last day possible, in part because of the way the games were presented to us as locals. And I think that was a mistake on the part of the government officials to really encourage us not to be here in a lot of ways, and that left a really lousy taste in our mouths. And tickets were not cheap, of course. And you had to imagine, because they went on sale so far in advance, you had to imagine sort of what it was going to be like, where we were going to be. And as and perhaps listeners know, we had a political curveball thrown a mere month before the Olympics. And so the energy was very sour. And I think none of us could have anticipated that it would become this absolutely magical, enchanting success story with, some complications. Obviously, the preparations for the games in any host city is quite heavy. And on the impressive side, there were very few site-specific new builds, right? They were repurposing primarily 85 to 90% of the venues were existing. And the bike lanes were already there. And there were already things in place to make this sort of seamless. But Paris is not the most accessible city, so that presents another challenge. And some of the other subway and transport extensions that were supposed to be finished were not. Some were, but most were not, including the Airport Express train that's been, I feel like we've been hearing about this for 15 years, but that is also delayed. I think now the deadline is 2030. But what I really hope the lasting effect will be is, A, now that we've just finished the Paralympics, that we continue having these conversations about the lack of accessibility, because it is so egregious and visible, and not only for people who are dependent on wheelchairs, but if you have a stroller, a cane, a suitcase, like there are all sorts of scenarios where people are limited in their mobility, and the bus systems are the better option, but they're not perfect. The trams are good, but they're not used within the city center. And so you're really talking about needing to update and retrofit a very old metro system. And that costs upwards of 20 billion euros, apparently. So what I'm hoping is that that's going to be the thing that we now have seen. We need to do this. This needs to be the next priority. I wish that had been a priority over the work on the Seine, which is it is what it is. I think it's an interesting project, and it's certainly, a body of water that we should have better access to. But, if it was about trying to update certain metro stations that were going to be heavily used versus that, whatever. This is how I would have spent the budget, the $1 billion budget, if it were up to me. But then I also think, if we're really careful, the joy and the magic that we experienced, and that French people in particular experienced, and I think that's a really positive memory for us to have, and also for the foreigners who couldn't stop gushing about how spectacular it was, and how well done and clever and this and that the experience was. And so I worry that people have a short-term memory, but I also think that all it takes is sort of looking through a few of the millions of images that we saw during that time to remember, like, we really did this. This was Paris in a way that we haven't seen it in 100 years or ever. I mean, 100 years since the previous games, but Paris didn't look the same then. We weren't the same then. So it's an interesting milestone. But I do think that if we're following the Olympics trajectory, it's going to be a long time before we know the long-term payoff. And I think hopefully the long-term benefit will also be for the department of Seine-Saint-Denis, which is north of Paris, the suburb just north of it, where most of the events were held. You have the Stade de France, you had La Défense Arena, you had the Olympic Village, which is being transformed into, I want to say it's for 6,000 residents. It's going to be private homes / social housing, daycare, businesses, really trying to build up what they're considering a sort of eco neighborhood. But ultimately, I think we're so close to the experience still, so it feels momentous.
Do you still feel like the magic has lingered? And did French people stay? Like, what ultimately did many people decide to do in terms of staying in the city versus abandoning it?
No, Parisians left.
Okay.
For the most part, they left. But the number one tourist group throughout the Olympic period were French travelers. So we see a lot of, obviously, the Americans, but if we're talking about the numbers, we're talking about several million travelers. Among them were tons and tons of French travelers who came because this is a totally unique experience. And some of them live within Île-de-France, which is the Paris region. And so they might come in for the day. They could come overnight. And I think that is just as important as impressing sort of the rest of the world. Because, like I said, the rest of France and Paris, there's always sort of this interesting relationship, probably going back to the royal court and, Paris being the home and the hub of everything and of leadership and the monarchy. And so for there to be a positive experience for people who live either in the countryside or from other cities, I think it's crucial.
I would love to pivot into the things that you have gleaned over the years that you could share with travelers who are coming to both Paris and to France. And I think a big one that comes up a lot, and I'm thinking about this because I'm going to Japan next month, etiquette, like the things that you don't know when you don't live in a city, when you aren't from this country. And there's the kind of classic, like, American loud travelers going to France. But what do you think, maybe on a slightly more subtle level, people should know before making a trek?
Well, I think etiquette is important insofar as salutations. They don't expect you to speak French or be able to put together a sentence necessarily, but you really do need to start with sort of the niceties. And those are quite easy to master. Bonjour, ça va? Asking some, if needed, some simple questions like where's the bathroom, all of that. But it's important because they take great pride in certain exchanges, particularly when you go into a shop, a restaurant, and if you're going to ask a question, you don't launch into something. You have to start by greeting them. You say, "Bonjour, yes, I have a question. Est-ce que blah 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 blah." And the sort of tension comes when someone thinks they can, because it works in their country, they can just sort of, with a smile, start asking a question without having said hello first. And that seems like maybe a superfluous step, but for them, it's very important. And it means you see them, you respect them. They're not just there to help you in some sort of transaction or service. And then, there's the etiquette when it comes to tipping, which everyone gets into a bit of a tizzy about. But what I will say is that the standard, what is presented to you when you get a bill is what they call service compris, but it is essentially it is not tip. It is a service charge that is, sort of roped in or woven into the final cost. And people think that they need to leave what is customary in other countries. So if we're speaking about Americans in particular, they would try to leave, 15, 18% on top of the bill. And that is simply not necessary. I mean, of course, they're going to be happy, but it isn't necessary. And that is because the prices are already meant to include sort of like I said, that service charge, but also the servers are getting paid a living wage. And that is not the case, we know, in the U.S. service industry. So what we tend to say now is that if you'd like to leave a tip, somewhere between 5 to 10% is completely acceptable. If the experience was horrible or you were mistreated, do not leave anything. And what we're seeing more of now, only in the last couple of years, are restaurants that have a built-in option on their credit card machine to leave a digital tip. And it's creating a little bit of confusion, I think, among Parisians, because they see this and it's presented as sort of an intermediary step, and the person who hands them the machine is not watching but lingering. And so it's this awkward, well, what if I say no to the question of, do you want to leave a tip? I think it's in a lot of cases meant more for the foreign traveler. But it happens enough now where it's still being explained a little bit when they first hand you the machine, like, oh, it's going to ask you if you want to do this. You can say no. And you're sort of like, can I say no? So it's happening. It's still slow to develop. You may come and visit and not see it at all. But if you go to the establishments that have more of an international and local clientele, fun, cocktail bars, small plates, spots, you're going to see it a little bit more. And so you shouldn't be surprised and you shouldn't feel obligated. And if you still prefer to leave a couple of coins on the counter, you can do that too.
And if you did want to leave a digital tip, would you recommend the 5-10% is still a completely customary? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, there are still some Americans, and I have experienced this firsthand, who physically recoil at the idea of leaving small, such a small percentage, because they are just so formatted by the American way. And so they will invariably leave more. And again, the person on the other end will be thrilled, but it is really not needed or expected in the way that it is in the US. And by the same token, I think, you leave a shop, you leave a restaurant, you say thank you upon leaving. And this is just sort of the bookend of the experience, the hellos, the goodbyes, and, if that's all you can manage in French, that'll already be quite good.
I love that. Just a reminder to acknowledge the person. For someone who does have a little bit more language under their belt, but falls into that circumstance where, you try the French and then it comes back in English, how do you recommend handling that dance?
I say, if you really just want to practice, just keep keep speaking in French and they'll keep speaking back to you in English. I mean, it's frustrating, but I always joke that I think they're just less patient than the Italians, who are blown away by anybody who can even attempt to speak a full Italian sentence, which is what happens to me every time I try to speak Italian. There's just like this level of encouragement that is so uplifting, and that is not really what you get here. But if you want to, just keep doing it. Just keep speaking. You know, even people who live here who are trying to improve their French, they get so destabilized by that. And I think you could also just say in French, you could say, I'm really trying to learn. Can we please speak in French?
Yeah. Okay.
And if they don't want to, play ball, then that's on them.
Of
but
course,
you've tried to make it a formal request. And I think usually when you take that extra step, they understand better. They understand why you're insisting, and they're a little bit more amenable.
Is there anything else that you would recommend, maybe when it comes to packing or fashion? I mean, there's the old don't wear the running shoes trope.
Right. But there's the trendy sneaker, which is basically the default footwear style in France for the last, 12 years. It's very casual. I mean, that's the thing. Going out in Paris is very casual, with the exception of a Michelin starred or two restaurant and some of these sceney places, where people want to get dressed up. But that's fewer and fewer today. So, a nice pair of jeans and something nice on top. But there's a difference between wearing Hoka sneakers and, a Veja, more city appropriate shoe. But heels, like high heels, who even bothers anymore? I mean, truly, unless you're taking a cab from door to door, no one really wears them anymore. Certainly not a high heel. Boots, trendy boots, low boots, all of that is completely fair. And what I will say is that it is completely acceptable to exercise in public, which wasn't the case when I moved. People wouldn't be caught dead wearing exercise gear or athleisure, right? So that has changed quite a bit. So if you're like, oh, I'm not going to go running in Paris, absolutely go running in Paris.
Okay, yeah.
Ride a bike. If you're a big cyclist, do that in Paris. Wear your spandex. It's fine.
Okay.
Just maybe don't go out for lunch in it after, right?
Got it.
That's going to be the thing. You have to then get into regular clothes if you're going to go out and about, eating and mingling.
Don't do the athleisure brunch.
The whole leggings all day thing it will raise some eyebrows.
Well, it's such a big city. I know that you couldn't possibly tell everyone where to go and what to do, but what are some of the things right now that you would either love to take someone to if there's coming to visit? Could be food, could be something to do, or something that you think people should really, invest in experiencing.
Well, what I like to say is that Paris is set up in such a way that you can really, if let's say you have 3 or 4 days, you can really break each day down into one particular area, and you can cover quite a lot of ground. If you're going to say one day is going to be the left bank and you're going to go between, the area around the Bon Marché and then go over to the Jardin des Plantes and walk along the river. I mean, these are all things you can do and map out in a very easy way. And I would say do that, but also make sure if you're only here for a few days that some of those neighborhoods are around Eastern Paris. So, the Canal Saint-Martin and where that leads, which is to the La Villette, where there's another body of water and there are cafes and activities along there. Belleville, I mean, I'm excited. My dad is coming to visit in November, and I cannot wait to take him to some of my favorite spots up in Belleville, which he doesn't know. He's come so infrequently, and when he is here, he has this sort of agenda, but this time he's like, it's just me. Bring me to your favorite spots.
Oh, that's so cool.
So I'm going to take him to Cheval d'Or, which is a restaurant I absolutely love, which is in Belleville. It's an international team. The chef is Filipino-Australian, and he's cooking this absolutely incredible mashup of sort of French and Chinese in a way that is sort of makes you want to rethink the word fusion, because it's actually a good thing, and it's respectful in the way it's done, and it's inventive, and the flavors are incredible. I'd take him for coffee up there. I would take him to the Butte-Chaumont Park, which he's never seen before. Up in the 18th, there's La Petite Ceinture, which is sort of this disaffected railway that has become kind of a preserved hangout. You can walk along this section of the tracks, and then there's a big restaurant cafe where they also do upcycling called La Recyclerie, which is there. And, there are these different corners of Paris that give you a completely different experience. And so if that's something you're interested in, getting a mix of like your favorite place the last time you came, and then also something that reflects a side of Paris you don't know as well, you can really mix and match in that way. And the canal is just always fun. I love seeing the variety of people lingering on a weekend on both sides of the canal, and where they go to eat, where they go to drink after. Take the time to, at least incorporate some neighborhood you've experienced less.
And it sounds like those are all outside of kind of the primary tourist bubble.
I mean, you do see tourists, of course. The Canal Saint-Martin especially has become, far more visible on the tourist itinerary, but it is not by any means like walking through the Marais, for example. And yet it's not super far. I mean, these are all 15, 20-minute walks from each other. And Belleville, I think, is just very special. And there's a lot that you can do up there, eating more traditional Chinese food. There are cocktail bars, there are bookstores, there are art galleries. I mean, this is a thriving neighborhood that has a lot to offer, and also gives you great views over the city. If you get off at the metro Pyrénées or Jourdain, and you're sort of higher up on the hill, and you get this amazing view. And at one point you can even see the Eiffel Tower from afar. So it gives you a different perspective on the city.
And you'd mentioned so many more bike lanes. Does Paris have a bike sharing program? Like, is that something that's pretty easy to do?
They do. They have the Vélib bikes, and then they have Lime bikes, which you can, you have an app and you can get. But the Vélibs are obviously, the complaint sometimes is that they're often out of order. So, the city needs to get on that. But they have the regular version or the electric, green and blue. And so they're all scattered all throughout the city, and you can download the app to make sure you know how to pick it up, drop it off, even reserve a parking spot if it's available. It's quite seamless, and people are using them.
What have you seen in terms of, like, if you were to paint a portrait of Paris as a whole, culinarily speaking, what might you say? How has it changed, and what's exciting?
I think what feels really exciting now is that the foreign chef has been pivotal in shaping French food, or the Parisian bistro, the neo bistro, in the last 10 years. The more immigrant cuisines have taken longer to sort of affirm their role in the landscape. And by that, I mean, there was sort of a dialing down of flavors. There was a flattening of some of their traditions. If you think about Paris's history with Chinese immigration and North African immigration and West African immigration, these individuals, when they came and started setting up businesses, tried to basically, fit in. And so one of the conversations I had recently with someone who's a French Vietnamese food consultant was that when he thought about how his parents had to adapt when they came, this was a time when the French tended to blend all of the Asian cuisines together. And so you'd have all these restaurants that would do Vietnamese and Chinese and a bit of Japanese, and that appears very strange, but they weren't going to fight it because they were like, I'm here to survive, I need to blend in, I'm not going to rock the boat. And now finally, with the sort of second and third generation from immigrant backgrounds, they are doing what I think other cities have done much faster and maybe much more successfully, thinking of LA, thinking of London in some respects, really affirming these culinary traditions. And so you're starting to see that even institutions like Lao Siam, which is an amazing Thai Laotian place in Belleville, actually, when the three sons took over from their parents, they sort of overhauled the menu and dialed it down to what they felt were, more essential dishes, less tangential, less sort of catering to other tastes. And then their second establishment, which is called Amasiam, which is fantastic, is all the types of dishes that they ate at home as kids, which was not necessarily exclusively Thai or Laotian. And it's a much more modern dining experience, and they pair it with natural wine. And so there's sort of this moment of saying all of these culinary traditions can coexist, and we do not need to flatten them for a local dining audience because they feel spice is not acceptable or these flavors are not acceptable. This is what the cuisine is. And it comes at a time, obviously, when the local population is hungry for this. They want the real stories and they want the real culinary experiences. And so I think that's quite exciting that we have, the best neo-bistros, these amazing classic restaurants that are getting updated as well. And then we have some of the best, North African, Chinese, Vietnamese food. And it's bolder in the way that it should have always been.
Well, I know where I'm going to go next time I visit. Well, I'd love to talk quickly about your second book, The New Parisian, The Women and Ideas Shaping Paris, because you featured more than 40 women who, I'm reading from the book jacket, but who challenge the oversimplified archetype of the Parisian and reveals Paris as a blossoming cultural center of feminine power. I mean, that's quite an impressive statement. So this was published in 2020. How have you seen that evolve, continue? Like, have you continued to see women come to power in that way and work on shaping?
Absolutely. Women are crucial to sort of this, not just the future of Paris, but crucial to what France is going to look like moving forward. And we see that in the political space with some of the candidates, even in the most recent legislative and parliamentary elections, who we got to know for the first time, who are bold and opinionated and with great ideas, who will probably have a more visible role moving forward. You see that in the arts for sure, and you see that in food in a big way. That doesn't mean it's been nothing but acceptance, because that would be untrue. I mean, even Michelin is notoriously still behind on, really sussing out the women who deserve to be considered for recognition. And, they always have some excuse as to why there aren't more women nominated or featured. And, it's an excuse that just doesn't land anymore. But the difference now is that women are really vocal about it. And the activist groups in all sorts of areas. I mean, activism is a big word. I mean, it could be just sort of mild social media activism to being in the streets and trying to fight for things. But whether that's in the food world or in the arts or in social justice, I mean, this is a city that is, really not about holding back in any way. And that's for sure always been true. But I think, since the Me Too movement and even more since COVID, I think we've seen that in a big way. And I think it's because once it's sort of let out, you can't put that, the voice back in the box.
Do you think it's on a similar trajectory as it has been in the United States, or do you think it has been different because, of course, the cultures are different?
I would say that there are moments where it aligns quite a bit. And I think people women especially, just want to be taken seriously. If they say something has happened, if they say this is a barrier to us, it needs to be treated as seriously as it is. And I think that's what we're fighting for now. It's not sort of revealing that all these challenges exist, but it's saying like, okay, now what are we doing about them? And so you have loads of vocal women and active women who get people involved in the way they feel comfortable getting involved, but it's constantly being talked about. And I think just the sheer fact that we have a dialogue, an endless dialogue about some of these issues, means that we've come a long way in the last 6 to 7 years.
All right. Very last question for you. For someone who's planning a trip or just loves Paris/France in general, are there any books, podcasts, movies that you would recommend aside from yours?
Oh, yes. For a food book, there's a food book that just came out called Amuse-Bouche by Carolyn Boyd. She's a British writer and has written on travel themes for much of her career. And this book breaks down essentially 200 something little vignettes and food specialties from all of France's regions. And so if you're someone who likes the idea of traveling based on food and based on gastronomy and have very particular interests, if it's seafood, if it's, cassoulet or it's some dish, she gives history and stories and anecdotes. And I think it's a really interesting way of documenting France by food. So it's called Amuse-Bouche and
I love it.
Quite new. Podcasts. I'd say what seems to be sort of a better platform for what's happening might be Substack, actually. So the newsletter option. So I have one, but there's Paris by Mouth, which is pure food and restaurant reviews and restaurant insights and anecdotes. What's open in August? What's open on a Sunday? This is sort of like a very interesting reference to have and to have access to. David Leibovitz is an excellent resource as well. But I would also say, on food, if you're going to be traveling outside of Paris and aren't sure where to, sort of look for restaurants, Le Fooding has in their repertoire plenty of reviews and listings for other cities. So I often use it if I'm going to be in, I don't know, let's say Nantes or Marseille or some other area. I mean, search by the destination, and it'll come up with the reviews that they've most recently covered. And I think that's at least it gets you in the right direction. It's a good gauge. It won't steer you wrong.
Great. Thank you. We'll link to those in the show notes, but I appreciate you taking the time and just sharing your expertise.
Well, thank you. This is a delight, and I really hope people keep coming. The Olympics may be over, but Paris is still thriving in 1,000 other ways.
And that was Lindsey Tramuta. In the show notes, we've linked to her website, her books, as well as to her podcast. I've also linked to some of the stories she's written for Afar over the years. And that concludes our first in this Off the Beaten Path series. If there's a destination you'd like us to explore through a local's eyes, email us at unpacked@afar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast newsletter, Behind the Mic. The link is in the show notes. Next week, we'll be back with an exploration of the hotels that are luring travelers with promises of a better night's sleep.
I'm not the only person paying attention to society's wakefulness. The $585 billion sleep industry is vast, and it was inevitable that it would eventually collide with the world of travel. I am talking, of course, about the rise of the sleep destination. Maybe you've noticed, over the last year or so, a growing number of hotels and resorts have begun luring guests with the promise of better sleep. The specifics of these programs vary widely. Some are built on a solid foundation of scientific research. Others seem more drawn by pseudoscience. Some do their best to help you sleep that night, others want to change your habits permanently. What they all have in common is they blew my mind when I heard about them. For as long as I've been paying attention to it, the travel industry has revolved around things you do with your eyes open. Seeing great scenery, eating amazing food, enjoying luxurious accommodations. The idea of traveling somewhere to go unconscious is incredible to me, and a reflection of something truly fascinating about where we are as a civilization.
Ready for more unpacking? Visit afar.com and be sure to follow us on Instagram and X. We are at Afar Media. If you enjoyed today's exploration, I hope you'll come back for more great stories. Subscribing always makes that easy. And be sure to rate and review the show on your favorite podcast platforms. It helps other travelers find it. And if you ever want to ask a question or suggest a topic for coverage, you can reach out to us at afar.com/feedback or email us at unpacked@afar.com. This has been Unpacked, a production of Afar Media. The podcast is produced by Aislinn Green and Nikki Galteland. Music composition by Chris Collin. And remember, the world is complicated. We're here to help you unpack it.